divided on whether this is a sign of blessing or something darker. What happened in Mecca recently caught many people off guard. The sky shifted into a deep red tone. Violent storms formed suddenly, and a powerful flood swept through one of the most sacred places on Earth. Everything unfolded so quickly that few had time to process it. Some see it as extreme weather. Others believe there may be a deeper meaning behind it. But what if this wasn't just another event? What if it was something people didn't recognize in time? Stay with me until the end as we explore this together and uncover what really happened and what it could mean. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Something shifted and it didn't feel normal. It began with the sky. Not gradually, not quietly, but suddenly. A deep red tone spread across the horizon, thick with dust, heavy in the air, turning daylight into something unfamiliar. People looked up confused, some stopping mid-step, others continuing as if nothing had changed. But let me ask you, if you saw the sky change like that, would you ignore it? Within minutes, the wind intensified. Not a simple gust, but rotating currents. Swirling dust rising into the air, forming violent patterns that resembled small tornadoes. The ground began to disappear under layers of sand and debris. Visibility dropped. The atmosphere felt unstable. And still, people were there, walking, praying, moving forward. Then came the storm. Rain didn't start lightly. It poured. Heavy, fast, overwhelming. Water rushed through the streets, building momentum, pushing everything in its path. What had been dry ground moments earlier turned into moving water, and right at the center of it all, the Kaaba. Pilgrims continued their movement, circling, soaked, slipping, trying to keep their balance as the surface beneath them became dangerously slick. Some fell, others reached out to help. But the water didn't slow down. It carried objects, shook structures, created a scene that felt chaotic, almost unreal. Pause for a second. Imagine standing there, surrounded by thousands of people, the ground unstable, the sky unnatural, the storm intensifying. Would you still think this is just weather? Because that's the question everyone started asking. Authorities moved quickly, closing roads, shutting down access points, sending in emergency teams. But even with that response, the feeling didn't go away. Something about this moment felt different, not just because of the storm itself, but because of where it happened. This wasn't just any location. This was one of the most sacred places on Earth. And when something like this happens in a place like that, people don't just see it. They interpret it. Some said it was climate. Others said it was coincidence. But others quietly began asking a deeper question. Why here? Why now? And more importantly, what if this wasn't random at all? Because moments like this don't just appear out of nowhere. They build, they escalate, and sometimes they point to something people don't immediately recognize. So stay with me, because what happened next and what this could actually mean goes far beyond a storm. The rain kept intensifying, not easing, not slowing, but building, layer after layer, until the ground could no longer absorb it. Water began to collect rapidly. First, in low areas, then spreading outward, turning streets into streams, and streams into something much more dangerous. Within a short time, parts of the city were overwhelmed. Roads disappeared under rushing water. Vehicles became trapped. Movement slowed, then stopped entirely. Emergency teams were deployed, trying to redirect flow, clear blocked drains, and assist those caught in the worst areas. Schools and public facilities were shut down as conditions became increasingly unstable. But at the center of it all, something even more striking was unfolding. Around the Kaaba, the situation grew intense. Pilgrims who had come for prayer suddenly found themselves surrounded by water. The ground became slick, almost impossible to walk on without slipping. Every step required effort. Every movement demanded focus. Some tried to continue their path, circling as they had planned. Others paused, uncertain, watching the water rise around their feet. You could see the hesitation. People looking at each other, trying to understand what was happening in real time. The rain didn't stop. Water continued to push forward, carrying debris, shaking loose objects, creating waves that disrupted the steady flow of people. The sound of the storm mixed with voices, movement, urgency. It wasn't panic, but it was close. And yet what made this moment so powerful wasn't just the flood itself. It was the contrast. On one side, chaos, water rushing surfaces unstable, the environment shifting. On the other routine, people still praying, still moving in patterns they had followed for years. Two realities happening at the same time, overlapping, almost colliding. This is where the tension begins to rise. Because when something this unusual happens in such a specific place, people don't just react, they start asking questions they didn't ask before. Was this simply a natural overflow, the result of extreme weather building over time? Or was this something more, something that carried meaning beyond what could be seen? The timing didn't feel random, the location didn't feel random, and the way it unfolded sudden, intense, impossible to ignore, left behind more than just water. At first, everything seems explainable. Extreme weather happens. Scientists point to climate instability, shifting pressure systems and rising temperatures, heavy rain, strong winds, sudden flooding. These are all natural processes. From this view, what happened in Mecca could simply be the result of unusual but explainable conditions, and that explanation is reasonable. But here's where things begin to feel different. Not every storm creates this kind of reaction. Not every event makes people stop and question what they just witnessed, and not every location carries the same meaning. When something like this happens in an ordinary place, it passes quickly, but when it happens in a place considered sacred by millions, it changes how people interpret it. So the questions start. Why this moment? Why this place? Why did it feel so sudden, so intense? Because alongside the scientific explanation, another perspective begins to form. A quieter one, but harder to ignore. The idea that some events are more than physical, that they may carry meaning beyond what we can measure. This is where tension rises. One side says, this is nature. The other says, this is a sign. And most people stand somewhere in between, unsure which to believe. But history shows something important. Moments like this, unexpected, powerful, and centered in places that matter, don't just happen and disappear. Sometimes they come before something else. Not always destruction, but often a warning. And if that's true, then the real question isn't what caused the storm. The real question is, what are we supposed to notice? And this is where everything begins to connect. Because what we're seeing is not unfamiliar, not if you look back at what Jesus actually said. In one of his most direct warnings, he described a pattern that many overlooked at the time, but becomes impossible to ignore now. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Think about that for a moment. In Noah's time, people weren't waiting for disaster. They weren't preparing. They were living normally. Eating, drinking, building, planning, continuing life as usual. Nothing seemed out of place. There was no visible sign that everything was about to change. Until it did. The flood didn't begin slowly. It came suddenly. And by the time people realized what was happening, it was already too late to respond. Now compare that to what we just saw, a sudden shift in the sky. Violent storms forming without warning. Water rising quickly, disrupting everything in its path. And right in the middle of it, people continuing their routines, moving forward, not fully aware of what was unfolding around them. This is the pattern. Not destruction first, but warning. Jesus didn't describe these signs to create fear. He described them so people would recognize the moment before it escalates. Because the purpose of a sign is not to end something immediately, but to give time. Time to notice. Time to reflect. Time to respond. But here's the part most people miss. In Noah's time, the warning was visible long before the flood. The ark was being built. The message was clear, but people ignored it. Not because it was hidden, but because it didn't seem urgent. And that's what makes this moment different. Because now the signs don't come in one form. They come in layers, in patterns, in events that seem separate, but feel connected when you step back and look at them together. So ask yourself honestly, if this follows the same pattern, are we recognizing it? Or are we doing exactly what people did before, seeing it, but not really seeing it? Drop your thoughts below. Do you think this is just coincidence or something more? What makes moments like this so striking is not just what happened, but how people responded to it. Because even as the sky changed, even as the storm intensified, even as the water began to rise, life didn't stop. People kept moving. Pilgrims continued their prayers. The routine carried on almost untouched, even while the environment around them was shifting in real time. And that's the detail that matters. Not the storm itself, but the contrast. On one side, everything was changing. The air, the ground, the conditions. On the other, everything stayed the same. The same movements, the same patterns, the same focus. It's not that people didn't see what was happening. They did. But they didn't fully process it, and that's exactly what Jesus described. In the days of Noah, people weren't blind. They saw the warnings. They heard the message. But they didn't treat it as urgent. It didn't interrupt their thinking. It didn't change their direction. They knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. Matthew 24:39. The same pattern appears here. The signs were visible. The sky didn't hide what it was becoming. The storm didn't arrive quietly. The flood didn't rise slowly enough to go unnoticed. Everything was happening in plain sight. But recognition is not the same as understanding. Because understanding requires a shift. It requires someone to stop to question, to step back and ask, what does this mean? And that didn't happen for most. Instead, the moment passed like so many others. Observed, recorded, shared, but not truly understood. The focus remained on what was happening, not on why it was happening. And that's where the warning becomes clear. Because if a sign appears and no one responds to it, then its purpose is lost. Not because it failed, but because it was ignored. The sign wasn't hidden. It was ignored. That's the difference between seeing and recognizing. And history shows that when that gap exists, when people continue forward without reflection, the outcome doesn't change. It repeats, not because people didn't have a chance, but because they didn't take it. The rain slowed. The floodwaters began to settle. The chaos that had filled the air just a moment before started to fade. But as people lifted their eyes, the sky revealed something that stopped them completely. A figure formed within the clouds, shaped in a way that many described as unmistakable. From a distance, it looked like a presence, like someone looking down. Not just a random formation, but something that felt intentional, watching over the very place where everything had just happened. People didn't just see it, they reacted to it. Some stood still, unable to look away. Others pointed, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. There was no clear explanation, no immediate answer, only a shared feeling spreading through the crowd. A mix of awe, confusion, and something deeper. Because when something like this appears right after a moment of chaos, it doesn't feel disconnected. It feels connected. As if what just happened and what appears next are part of the same message. Some believed it was simply clouds shaped by wind, but others saw it differently. They saw it as a sign. As the appearance of Jesus looking down, observing, reminding. Not in anger, not in destruction, but in presence. A moment that didn't force fear, but made people feel seen. And that feeling changes everything. Because when people believe they are being watched, not judged immediately, but observed, they begin to reflect differently. The storm becomes more than weather. The flood becomes more than water. It becomes personal. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Matthew 24-30. That verse speaks of a moment when something appears in the sky that causes people to stop and recognize. Not everyone will understand it the same way. Not everyone will respond the same way, but no one will ignore it completely. And that's exactly what happened. Some dismissed it, some questioned it, but many felt it, because whether it was truly a sign or not, the impact was real. And sometimes it's not about proving what it was, it's about asking why it appeared at that exact moment. So now everything leads to one final question. If moments like this are not random, then what are they trying to tell us? Because when you step back and look at the full picture, the red sky, the violent storm, the sudden flood, and then that image in the sky, it doesn't feel like isolated events anymore. It feels connected, like pieces of something bigger unfolding step by step. And this is exactly where people begin to divide. Some will say it's all coincidence, a chain of natural events happening at the same time. Nothing more, no deeper meaning. But others will see a pattern, not a message of immediate destruction, but a warning. Because throughout Scripture, judgment is never the first step. It is always preceded by signs. By moments that interrupt normal life just enough to make people stop and think. Not to force fear, but to give time. Time to recognize, time to reflect, time to change direction. And that's what makes this moment so important. Because in the days of Noah, people had that time. They saw the signs. They heard the warnings. But they didn't respond. They continued as if nothing would happen until it did. Noah was different, not because he was stronger, not because he had more information, but because he recognized what others ignored. He acted while there was still time, and that made all the difference. So now the question becomes personal. If a sign appears today, whether through nature, through events, or through something we don't fully understand, how do we respond? Do we dismiss it? Do we ignore it? Or do we pause long enough to ask what it might mean? Because the truth is, judgment is not only about destruction. It is also about opportunity, a moment given before something greater unfolds. A chance to see clearly before it's too late. And maybe that's what this is. Not an ending, but a warning. So I want to hear from you. What do you think? Was this just a coincidence or something more? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more. Thank you for watching. Heavy rains are affecting the Jeddah and Mecca regions of Saudi Arabia, prompting a red alert. Thousands and thousands of crickets swarming all over. I'm a prisoner in its lips. This one is sun. Same time, 2 times sun. Something unusual just happened in Mecca, and it's raising questions no one can easily answer. Floodwaters surrounded one of the most sacred places on Earth. Lightning lit up dry deserts in ways people couldn't explain, and the sky itself seemed alive with movement. At first, these events felt separate, but when placed together, they began to form a pattern. Are these just natural occurrences, or could they point to something deeper? In this video, we're going to break down each moment one by one and explore what both science and scripture might reveal. Watch closely. Stay until the end. And if this makes you think, don't forget to like, share your thoughts, and subscribe. It began without warning. No gradual build-up, no time to prepare. Just a sudden surge of water moving through the sacred heart of Mecca, turning what should have been a place of stillness into a scene of urgency and confusion. Within moments, pathways that were once crowded with worshippers became channels of fast-moving floodwater, reflecting lights in chaotic motion as the situation escalated faster than anyone could fully process. At the center of it all stood the Kaaba, a structure that has remained a constant through centuries of change, now surrounded by rising water that crept higher with every passing minute. People who had gathered in peace suddenly found themselves navigating an environment that felt unstable, unfamiliar, and increasingly difficult to control. Shoes were abandoned belongings left behind, as attention shifted from routine to survival, from devotion to immediate safety. Emergency responses began unfolding almost instantly. Yet even those efforts seemed to struggle against the speed of what was happening. The sound of rushing water echoed through open spaces, mixing with urgent voices and distant announcements, creating an atmosphere that felt heavy, compressed, as if time itself had tightened. Some individuals moved quickly toward higher ground, while others paused, looking back, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. An image so rare that it felt almost unreal. The visual contrast was striking. A place known for order and rhythm, now overtaken by movement and unpredictability. Water flowed where it normally never would, reshaping the environment in real time, forcing constant adjustment with every step. Reflections shimmered across the surface, distorting familiar landmarks, making everything feel slightly disoriented, slightly altered. And yet what made this moment even more intense was not just the physical presence of the flood, but the feeling that something had shifted. Not permanently, not completely, but enough to leave an impression that lingered. Because for many watching both on the ground and from afar, this was more than a weather event. It was a disruption of expectation, a moment where the predictable gave way to something uncertain. And as the waters continued to move, one question quietly began to surface. If something like this could happen here in a place so central, so enduring, then what else might be unfolding next? And it didn't stop there. As the situation unfolded, reports began surfacing from beyond Mecca, pointing to a wider pattern that was impossible to ignore. In Jeddah, heavy rainfall quickly overwhelmed drainage systems, turning major roads into streams of moving water, while vehicles struggled to navigate conditions that shifted minute by minute. Similar scenes appeared across other regions, where dry ground, unused to sudden pressure, could not absorb the volume, forcing water to spread rapidly across urban areas. What made these events more unsettling was not just their intensity, but their timing. Areas known for arid climates were suddenly dealing with conditions that felt out of place, almost as if the environment itself had shifted without warning. Witnesses described streets filling faster than expected, visibility dropping as rain intensified, and entire neighborhoods pausing as people tried to understand whether this was temporary or something more serious. Then came the response. Authorities across Saudi Arabia began initiating large-scale evacuations, not as a precaution, but as a necessary action. Emergency alerts were issued, urging residents to move away from low-lying areas, while rescue teams worked to reach those already affected. Transportation routes became congested as families attempted to leave quickly, carrying only what they could manage, leaving behind anything that slowed them down. Shelters were prepared in safer zones, receiving a steady flow of displaced individuals, each with their own story of how quickly everything changed. Some had minutes to react, others slightly longer. But in every case, the decision was the same. Move now or risk being trapped. The atmosphere across these regions carried a shared tension, not just from what had already happened, but from uncertainty about what might follow. If you're watching this, take a moment not out of fear, but out of faith, and type Amen in the comments as a quiet prayer for protection, for safety, and for those still navigating through it right now. Across the western desert regions, something unusual began to unfold. Flashes of lightning appearing again and again, not in short bursts, tied to passing storms, but in a repeated, almost continuous pattern that drew immediate attention. These were not typical storm systems forming, moving, and fading. Instead, the sky remained active for extended periods, lighting up in sharp, sudden pulses that seemed disconnected from any familiar weather cycle. What made this even more striking was the location. These were areas known for dry air, minimal rainfall, and long stretches of stillness conditions that do not usually support prolonged electrical activity. Yet witnesses described the sky illuminating multiple times in quick succession, each flash cutting through the darkness with unusual clarity, followed by a silence that felt heavier than normal. There was no consistent thunder rolling afterward, no clear indication of a traditional storm system passing through, just light appearing and disappearing without a predictable rhythm. Observers in different locations reported similar experiences. The horizon would remain calm for a moment, then suddenly ignite with a bright streak followed by another, and then another, as if something unseen was triggering these bursts from above. The pattern didn't feel chaotic, but it also didn't match anything familiar. As some described it as watching the sky pulse, while others noted how the atmosphere itself seemed unusually still, as though everything had paused except the light. Scientifically, there are explanations that attempt to account for this. Dry lightning can occur in environments where precipitation evaporates before reaching the ground, leaving behind electrical discharges without rainfall. Atmospheric instability, temperature, contrasts, and shifting air masses can also contribute to unexpected electrical activity. But even with these explanations, the persistence and concentration of these flashes raised questions that were not easily settled. Because beyond the science, there was also interpretation. Some who witnessed these events reflected on Gospel of Luke 10:18. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Not as a literal conclusion, but as a symbolic connection. Light descending suddenly powerfully from above, leaving behind a moment that felt charged with meaning. And that is where the tension remained. Not in choosing between explanation and interpretation, but in recognizing that something about this pattern stood out. The desert, usually defined by its silence, had become a place of repeated illumination, where each flash seemed to interrupt the stillness just long enough to leave an impression. And then the sky didn't just flash, it began to move. Across multiple regions, reports emerged of massive swarms filling the air. Dragonflies, crickets, and other insects appearing in numbers large enough to alter the sky itself. At first, it seemed like a distant cloud forming along the horizon. But as it drew closer, the movement became clearer, more defined, more unsettling. This wasn't a passing cluster or a brief seasonal shift. It was sustained, coordinated motion that stretched across entire sections of the sky. Witnesses described how the insects moved in wave-like patterns, rising and falling together, almost as if responding to a shared signal. The formations would tighten, then expand, shifting direction without warning, creating a visual rhythm that felt structured rather than random. From a distance, it looked like a living current flowing, turning, and reshaping itself in real time. The sound added another layer to the experience. A constant low vibration filled the air, not loud enough to overwhelm, but persistent enough to be felt. It wasn't just heard. It lingered, creating a subtle pressure that made the environment feel different, slightly heavier. People paused, looking upward, trying to understand what they were seeing. As the sky itself seemed occupied by something active, something shifting. Scientifically, these swarms can be explained. Changes in climate patterns, temperature shifts, and environmental pressure can trigger large-scale insect migrations. When conditions align, populations can gather in extraordinary numbers, moving together for survival and reproduction. It is a known phenomenon, but rarely observed at this scale, and even more rarely in such concentrated formations. Yet for many, the imagery carried deeper associations. Moments like this have been compared to descriptions found in Book of Exodus, where swarms were not just natural occurrences, but events that captured attention, disrupted normal life, and left lasting impressions on those who witnessed them. Not everyone interprets it that way, but the connection is often made. Because when the sky darkens, not from clouds, but from movement, when the air hums with life instead of silence, it becomes more than just an observation. It becomes a moment people remember. And if you're still watching, take a second to like the video and subscribe, because what comes next may connect even deeper than expected. Beneath the surface, far from what the eye can easily observe, another layer of activity was beginning to shift. This time not in the sky, but deep within the oceans. Reports pointed to renewed underwater volcanic activity. Areas that had remained quiet for long periods suddenly showing signs of movement again. Unlike visible eruptions on land, these events unfolded largely out of sight, detected through seismic signals, pressure changes, and subtle disturbances in the surrounding waters. What made this development stand out was the lack of clear warning. In some cases, activity appeared to increase rapidly, with pressure building beneath the ocean floor until it reached a point of release. When that release came, it didn't always announce itself in dramatic visuals, but its effects could still spread outward, altering water temperatures, shifting currents, and influencing nearby marine environments. The ocean, often perceived as stable on the surface, began showing signs of internal disruption. Areas near these underwater systems experienced unusual changes, sometimes subtle, sometimes more noticeable, depending on proximity and intensity. For researchers, this falls within known geological behavior. Tectonic plates move, pressure accumulates, and eventually energy is released. It is part of how the planet functions. But timing plays a role in how events are perceived. When activity beneath the sea begins to align with unusual patterns above ground, whether in the atmosphere on land or across different regions, it draws attention. Not necessarily because each event is unexplainable, but because together they create a sense of connection that is harder to dismiss. Separate systems operating independently appearing to shift within the same window of time. In some discussions, references are made to Book of Revelation 8:8, which describes something like a great burning mountain being cast into the sea. Interpretations vary, and most remain symbolic rather than literal. Still, the imagery fire, ocean, sudden impact resonates with how people process events that involve both power and unpredictability. Scientifically, there is no mystery in the existence of underwater volcanoes. They have always been there, shaping the sea floor, influencing ecosystems, and contributing to the planet's long-term evolution. Yet what captures attention is not their existence, but their reactivation after periods of quiet. Because when something that has remained still begins to move again, it changes perception. It shifts awareness from what is visible to what is hidden, from what is stable to what may be building beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it can no longer remain contained. In parts of Saudi Arabia, particularly near open desert regions outside Mecca, observers began reporting something that immediately captured attention. What appeared to be two suns visible in the sky at the same time. At first glance, it looked like a reflection, a visual duplication hovering beside the real sun. But the clarity and brightness of the second light made it difficult to dismiss quickly. Witnesses described how the sky seemed unusually sharp, almost too clear, allowing the light to separate into distinct points. One sun held its expected position, while the second appeared slightly offset, glowing with a softer but still noticeable intensity. For several moments, both lights remained visible together, creating a surreal image that felt almost unnatural to those watching. This phenomenon has a scientific explanation. Under certain atmospheric conditions, especially when ice crystals form in high-altitude clouds, light can refract in ways that create what is known as a sundog or parhelion. These optical effects can produce bright spots of light on either side of the sun, sometimes giving the illusion of multiple suns in the sky. It is rare, but not impossible. However, what made this instance stand out was not just the occurrence itself, but how clearly it was observed. The second light didn't appear faint or barely visible. It stood out enough to draw immediate attention enough to make people stop, look twice, and question what they were seeing. In environments already experiencing unusual weather patterns, the appearance of a doubled sun added another layer to the unfolding situation. For some, it remained a natural optical event, an interaction between sunlight and atmospheric particles. For others, it carried symbolic weight. References are often made to passages describing signs in the heavens where light behaves in unexpected ways, prompting reflection rather than immediate conclusion. Moments like this sit at the intersection of explanation and perception. The science explains how it happens, but the experience of seeing it, of witnessing something that appears to break normal expectations, leaves a different kind of impact. And if you followed every detail so far, stay with this until the end. Because when all of these signs are placed together, the bigger picture may reveal something even more unexpected. When events unfold across different layers, sky, land, and sea, they are often studied separately, categorized, and explained within their own systems. Meteorology addresses atmospheric behavior. Geology explains movement beneath the surface, and environmental science tracks shifts in ecosystems. Each field offers its own framework, its own logic, its own conclusions. And in most cases, that separation works. But occasionally, patterns emerge that seem to stretch across those boundaries. Not because the events are identical, but because they appear within the same window of time, creating a sequence that feels interconnected. A shift in one domain followed closely by another, then another. Each one explainable on its own, yet collectively forming something more difficult to ignore. It is this clustering, this alignment, that begins to raise questions. Historically, moments like these have often led people to reflect more deeply. Not necessarily to draw immediate conclusions, but to consider whether timing itself carries meaning.